Amen.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer.
Amen.
Please be seated. One of this week's Sunday lectionary reading choices just happened to be from the book of Esther. And it's the only look we get at the book of Esther, included in the entire 3-year lectionary cycle for any mainstream Christian denomination. This book features one of the few times a woman is a heroine, an essential character of a Bible story, who acts with her own agency and authority. After rereading the book of Esther this past week, I was moved to share her story in today's sermon and the important lessons it imparts to us in our own age of political, racial, and cultural upheaval. Notably, this book tells a story about God and human politics without a single reference to God. Not only is God not a specific character in the book, but God is not even mentioned once, not even in the course of prayer. Yet, remarkably, this book was not trashed and abandoned to the pile of secularist, godless writings when the scroll of the book of Esther came under scrutiny nearly 2,000 years ago. Instead, it was elevated to the status of sacred scripture for Jews, to be included with the Old Testament wisdom writings. And eventually, for the Christian Bible, it was included with historical writings. Interestingly, the royal name for Queen Esther and her Hebrew name, Hadassah, are linked to the language of hiddenness. Scholars say the name Esther may be related to the Hebrew verb to hide, while Hadassah may be connected to the word for darkness, like being in the shadows. And as I flesh out the story a little bit more here for you, the behind-the-scenes maneuverings of God and Esther reveals the connections of hidden identity, both human and what I call the God incidences of the story. The many perfectly timed, miraculous plot twists that all coincidentally work together for the good of Esther and her people, the Israelites, and the triumphant and joyous ending. Before getting more actively into the story, though, let's first look at the historical background and context of the times as Esther's tale unfolds. The Jews, God's chosen people, are now in exile. Jerusalem was conquered and its people taken in chains into Babylonian captivity. Although Persians now rule and have allowed some Jews to return to Jerusalem, there are still the diaspora Jews who have married, settled, and made their homes in Susa, living as a recognized religious minority in the heart of the powerful Persian Empire. As an orphan, exiled foreigner, and a female, Esther is a nobody among nobodies in this Jewish minority community. We can see how this sets Esther up as an unlikely heroine. In fact, her personal story is a mirror image of the Hebrew people in Persian exile. Esther is herself an orphan without the security, identity, and rootedness of family. She appears to be rescued when she's taken in by her cousin Mordecai, who becomes her foster parent. Unfortunately, that turns out to be short-lived, though, because before long, because of her beauty, she's taken up in an empire-wide search to replace the king's defiant first wife. So she's taken from the safety of her cousin Mordecai's home in Susa to the king's harem. And after being chosen as the king's favorite, she's thrust into the intrigue, both political and sexual, of the Persian royal court. She's also in peril, very, very great peril, because she obeys her cousin's order to tell no one her race and family background. Then if we look at all the strikes against Esther and add to the list this last fact that she is a Jew, it's another drop in status, making Esther an extreme outsider in Persian culture, especially in the royal city of Susa. So we can imagine how Esther's situation is fraught with danger and puts her between a rock and a hard place as a resident alien, a foreigner, and a member of this peculiar tribe that Persians barely tolerate. Throughout it all, orphan, foster, consort, Queen Esther must decide whether and how to reveal her Jewishness within the dominant Persian culture. Early chapters of the book show Esther and her adoptive father, Mordecai, at times hiding, and other times revealing their Jewishness in varying contexts, to stay out of danger depending on the situation. As the plot takes twists and turns, we realize that the expression of their religious identity is not static, but depending on conditions, dynamic and responsive, because they constantly need to watch their guard, to stay one step ahead of their enemies, putting them in mortal danger. Keeping her identity secret at first was a strategy to deal with a perilous situation that eventually allowed Esther to gain power and status in the dominant Persian culture. But keeping her identity hidden also meant obscuring the God whose name and reputation was inextricably intertwined with that of the Jewish people, God's chosen people. Just prior to the start of chapter 7, where today's reading takes up Esther's tale, the plot thickens, with the story inviting us into this messy and compromising world, which these characters must negotiate to get around the inept king and the evil machinations of Haman, his prime minister, who is also the mortal enemy of her foster parent, Mordecai. Haman, seeking to rain down revenge because of a slight from Mordecai, has deviously gained approval from the bumbling and not too bright king to wipe out all the Jews throughout the Persian Empire, including women and children. When the political situation becomes dire and her people are threatened with genocide, Esther does finally reveal her identity, at great risk to herself. Mordecai urges her to do so, saying, "Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." He seems to be alluding to divine providence being at work, moving this Jewish orphan into a place of prestige in the Persian royal court at just the right time, so that she might protect her people, God's chosen people of the Old Testament. Mordecai makes a case to Esther that she must step into this particular historical moment. Her personal history intersects with the Jews' corporate history at this particular time and in this particular place. But even as Esther reveals herself and her affiliations to the king, she does so carefully and strategically. We also need to note that even before Esther works to preserve her people from Haman's evil plan, early in the story, Mordecai acts to save the life of the less than bright, rash, and pagan Persian king, which in the end is a huge plus for how everything turns out to save them all, after Esther heroically steps forward to speak for her people, as we heard in today's reading. Chapter 7, if we parse Esther's story in the language of literary analysis, this chapter, at the point where today's Old Testament reading opens, is the climax of the book of Esther, or in the language of reality TV, it's the big reveal. So what, as Christian readers, do we do with an Old Testament lesson like this, that satirizes an ancient and foreign king, provides a backstory for a Jewish festival, and contains no direct mention of God? Really, you might say, if the blood, war, and destruction were eliminated from the text, the satiric humor of the plot line almost resembles a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. Satire and humor are often adopted as a seemingly light treatment that writers use to speak serious, dangerous truth to power. It comments on the way things are, the dark reality of the brokenness of our life situations, taking aim at the powers of the world. Satire within Scripture embraces humor too, especially in this tale, even macabre humor, as a way to cope with a world marked by brokenness. If we are to learn a lesson from the book of Esther, most likely it doesn't lie in the content of its plot, but in the power of a good story to give us hope in the face of adversity. Esther does indeed step forward, though she initially resists Mordecai's request, knowing she risks her own life if she approaches the king on her own initiative. Importantly, Esther prepares by fasting and praying, and she also calls upon the support of others, asking them to fast and pray for her as she steps out to claim her God and her faith. We see these themes echoed in today's Psalm 124 and the New Testament reading from James as well, particularly in the verses of the psalm. If the Lord had not been on our side when enemies rose up against us, then would they have swallowed us up alive in their fierce anger toward us. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Esther takes the risk to speak up for her people, even though it could mean her own death. Deliverance comes through claiming her faith and true identity publicly. The king responds favorably, and the Jewish people are saved. Esther's brave leadership is enshrined in history through the annual festival of Purim in Judaism, which is a merry, joyous annual holiday on the Jewish calendar, which continues to be celebrated to this very day. Looking at the book of Esther through a contemporary lens, one scripture commentary notes, we might expect Esther as the queen to be aware of her own power and to exercise it. Yet at least up to chapter 7, Esther has not identified herself as a player in the king's political circles. She has not weighed in on policy or leveraged her position to maneuver into more power or others into power, or even strategized to produce a male heir, always historically the quickest path for women at court. She makes none of those power plays. When the king decrees the destruction of all Jews, the crisis then comes to a head. Esther's own Jewishness, so carefully hidden at court, now comes to a crucial point. Is she most deeply a Jew, or a cousin, or a Persian queen, or simply another woman whose life is determined by others in power? Who will she decide to be? At turning points in our own lives, at those large and small forks in the road on our journeys through life, how have we chosen to answer those same questions, which ultimately defines our identities, that show us to the world as who we really are and whose we ultimately belong to? Esther's story reminds me that it often only takes one person to make a difference in the world. Not only like people of stature, queens, or saints like Mother Teresa, but also the legions of unsung heroes in our lives. I'm sure we all could name at least one person who made a difference for us, setting us on a path towards good for us and ultimately for the good we do in the world. And hopefully, as we look to pay it forward, many of us have been that person for others too, and will unselfishly continue to do so. I am most grateful for Miss Jasinski, who was my 4th grade teacher. She is one of the great heroines in my life, who changed the trajectory I was on towards being a real burnout at the tender age of 10. She took me under her wing, gave me extra tutoring, helped me to think positively, achieve goals, and bolster my self of confidence. She nurtured me. She nurtured my spirit. And I was always an honor student after that year going forward. Amen. In preparation for this sermon, I ran across an article by Amy Oden, who commented on Queen Esther's struggle with identity and risk. She raised several critical questions for Christians today, which I think are so spot on that I wanted to share them with everyone, for us to prayerfully contemplate and maybe even fast over if the Spirit moves us. in the example of Esther. Amy Oden challenges us to prayerfully contemplate these questions in light of Queen Esther's story. How do we maintain our witness of faith in a culture dominated by material consumption and political brinksmanship? What power does any one of us really have to make a difference? What kind of risks are we willing to take on behalf of those vulnerable and threatened? How might God be preparing us to step forward to speak truth to power? The Apostle James, in today's New Testament letter, attests to the efficacy and power of prayer. So then, let our prayer be to seek God's strength and courage to publicly define and proclaim our own true identity, to be the salt Jesus is talking about, and seek ways, large and small, to make a difference for the good in our own contemporary times, still fraught with peril in the wake of the not unfinished vitriol of the last administration. To make a difference for the good by participating in the reinvigorated racial justice movement after George Floyd's murder. To be makers of peace amidst the chaotic violence of our local communities, and anchors of calmness to counter the anxiety by the upheaval and uncertainty of these pandemic times.
Yes.
Amen. Amy writes, the text from the book of Esther can fire our imaginations for such a time as this. For some of us, the courage of faith will fuel us to take risks in our own towns, neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. As importantly as for Esther, we must also speak truth to power, especially for those of us white people, when that power in politics and institutions is most likely us. I'll end by sharing one of those God incidences I mentioned earlier, which occurred while I was wrapping up writing my final version of this sermon. I had the TV on in the background, and I heard on the TV an excerpt of Debbie Allen's inspiring acceptance speech at the recent Emmy Awards ceremony. The legendary artist was presented the prestigious 2021 Emmy Governor's Award by Ava DuVernay, and joined on stage by Jada Pinkett Smith and other collaborators from her illustrious storied career. This stellar icon, Debbie Allen, after more than 5 decades in the industry, shined luminously as she gave her acceptance speech. She had what us spiritual types call a countenance of radiance about her. Amen. Allen, who has made and is still making a huge impact on her industry for people of color, especially for African Americans, celebrated receiving her flowers while also passing the torch to the next generation. To my ears, almost sounding like she was echoing Mordecai as a messenger from God in his behest to Queen Esther, Allen exhorted everyone she addressed in the audience and out in TV land. Now is a time to claim your voice. Now is a time to sing your song. Now is a time to tell your stories. In that moment, for me, Debbie Allen seemed to be channeling Queen Esther as she told her truth, saying, this recognition, it's been many years in the making. It's taken a lot of courage to be the only woman in the room most of the time. A lot of courage and creativity and fight and faith to believe that I could keep going, and I have. I want to say thank you for this glorious moment in the sun. Our congregation, our world, need Esthers, male and female, who will step into hard places of fear and cruelty, bitterness and injustice, to speak a word of life. Like this unsuspecting, vulnerable Old Testament queen, we too are part of God's story. Right here, right now, at this time, and in this place. Amen.
Amen.
So my response to that message that she just so eloquently personally gave is what God was saying to me in those moments. And I dedicate this to you this week. Trust me. I'm gonna say that last verse one more time. Sometimes people need to know that. I'll fight your battles. I'll fight your battles. You know me because what? I'll fight your battles. If you will know me, trust me. Trust me. Trust me. He said his word that I am yes, I have all power. Yes, I will believe if you will only trust me. Trust me. Trust me. If you will only trust me. Trust me. Oh, trust me. He still said, I am there. Yes, I have all power. The if you will only trust me. Trust me. Trust me. If you would only trust me. My word has not come back to me, boy. Trust me. Oh, trust me. Oh, you will only come to me. Trust me. Oh, trust me. Oh, trust me. I know you can't trust anybody else, but you have failed if you will only trust me. Oh, trust me. Trust me. If you will only trust me. I love you, trust